So given the topic of today's hearing, I'd like to focus, at least initially, on where we've been and on some of the things that have contributed to where we are, where we've been in the last few years. Mr. Bernstein, in your testimony, you shared your belief that we should have had more fiscal stimulus in the early years of this administration than we in fact had. You know, as you know, during the first 3 years of this administration, we added to the national debt, to the debt held by the public, by about $4.5 trillion. So do I take from your testimony that means that you think we should have added to the national debt to a greater degree than that over the first 3 years of the administration?
Well, let me clarify. First of all, my point is not that we should have done more early on, as you suggested. I actually thought what we did was ample. I think it ended too soon. So I think what needed was, once the economy was stabilized, we needed to do more to build on that stabilization. Now, on your debt and deficit point, I'd like to make a very, very important point that always gets overlooked in this conversation. It is not temporary measures that add to our fiscal problems, and we have real fiscal problems. In fact, if you read today's Congressional Budget Office long-term projection, there's no reference at all to temporary measures, many of which have expired, and in my view, as I just said, expired too soon. What hurts you on the fiscal front is not something that comes into the system and gets out of the system. Stimulus is by definition temporary. It's the long-term pressures coming from, say, healthcare costs and an aging demographic. If you actually look at the contribution of the measures that I was advocating to the deficit or the debt, they're actually adding zero to the deficit at this point and fractional to the debt.
Okay, so you're not saying that we should have added more debt during that initial 3 years, during the first 3 years of this administration?
Not during the first, say, 2 years, but starting in 2010, and I actually have a slide that shows this, starting around 2010, 2011 and forward, that's when we should have been doing more on the fiscal side, because at that point, fiscal policy was actually creating a significant drag on economic growth and holding back the stabilization effects that I thought we actually did handily in the first couple of years.
So just to be clear, you would say that during that third year we should have done more, such that during that 3-year window we should have added to the debt by an amount more than 4 point.
I want to be very.
How much more?
Well, first of all, I want to be very clear. When I talk about these kinds of measures that I'm advocating, I'm talking about temporary measures. And as I've stressed, the temporary measures that expire add nothing to the growth of the debt over the long term. And yes, I think we needed to do more to the tune of, let's just take 2013 as an example. In 2013, fiscal drag took 1.5% off of GDP growth. Fiscal drag that I would argue members of Congress were in no small part responsible for creating. 1.5% of GDP equates to about 0.5% of unemployment. That's over 1 million jobs. And it's actually 0.75% of unemployment. That's over 1 million jobs. So yes, I would have done more temporary measures to help avoid the fiscal drag that has kept this economy from reaching more people,
including adding to the debt by an amount greater than what was added to during that period.
Certainly, I'm advocating more temporary fiscal policy that, once it expires, adds nothing to the budget deficit and nothing to the growth of the debt.
Okay. Mr. Kudlow, what's your response to this, and what are the policies that you...
Well, look, Jared's a good friend, but we diametrically disagree, rather. I just want to say a couple things come to mind listening to Jared. 2013 was the sequester. And if you go back and look at the press clips and look at the CBO, we were supposed to have lost, I don't know, 700,000 jobs, 800,000 jobs. We didn't. We gained jobs. Job growth has been, you know, pretty steady in the last couple of years, 2% growth a year. All the calamities that we heard about never occurred. In fact, what's so interesting to me is, as I said in my opening remarks, all this federal spending stimulus and all this monetary stimulus didn't move the meter at all. We've been growing pretty steadily at 2% a year, which, as I said, is about half what we should have grown coming out of the deep recession, maybe less than half. So I just don't buy it. I don't think it can be quantified. People are talking about, counterfactual scenarios. If we didn't do this, it would have been worse. All I know is factually, here's what we had, and it's not good enough. I would have gone immediately into pro-growth tax reform. That's what I would have done. And I would have let the counter-cyclical safety net work its way, as it did. In effect, you sort of doubled the safety net. And then it ran out and didn't seem to have any appreciable impact on economic growth. That's why I argue, with all due respect, these multipliers don't work. They come from models that have been discredited, and they don't work. They didn't work in the past. They don't work today. I am surprised at some of the people on the Obama team that they went back and tried that. Less government, lighter regulation, greater tax incentives. If it pays more to work and invest after tax, you'll work and invest more. These are the things that I think we should have been doing. We should be revaluing the dollar, not devaluing the dollar. Here's a good point. The rate of spending has fallen. I like that. In fact, if I could think of one stimulus to the economy in the last few years, it's the fact that federal spending as a share of GDP has come down from a peak of close to 25%, 24.5%, to actually less than 21%. I think it's about 20.6, 20.7%. The deficit has also come down, but I'm a guy who looks at spending. To me, that gives the private sector more room to grow, and the government absorbs fewer funds. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. So I, have a different point of view with respect to my pal Jared on that. And I also think it's never too late to have good policy. So the president has talked about corporate tax reform. Senator Klobuchar, you talked about corporate tax reform. Why don't you do it? Just go on ahead and do it. You don't have to do all of it in one fell swoop. What I'm suggesting here, with all great respect to my friend Chairman David Camp, just work on the business side for now. Stop these firms from leaving. Stop them from taking the cash out of the economy. But you can't do that by penalizing them. They'll just shut down, particularly in this environment where the animal spirits of risk-taking are so low. People are still so risk-averse, because of what we went through 5 years ago, 6 years ago. Slash the corporate tax rate. Advertise it, talk about it, and slash it. We could disagree about the exact point. I want 20%. You want 25, you got a deal. You want 28? Senator, I'd probably take it, but I think it's too high. I think the OECD average is about 25%. That's where I'd go, but I'd go lower than that just to make America more competitive. And get rid of all the K Street bells and whistles. Just get rid of them. We don't need them. The Federal Reserve is ending its monetary stimulus in terms of bond buying. They're getting out of the bond business. This is good. It didn't do a whit of good. Not one whit. Didn't change the growth of the economy. In fact, long-term interest rates went up during most of these quantitative easings, not down, although they anchored the Fed funds rate at 0%. Here's a combination. You cut the corporate tax rate, let the market move interest rates up at the short end and the long end, as they will, and you'll have yourself a roaring recovery. I mean a roaring recovery. That's yes, this was the Reagan prescription. Yes, this was the John F. Kennedy prescription. And yes, I believe it will work again. A critic of mine said, oh, it's so 1979. And I said, yeah, okay, pal. You know the way I look at it? It's so 1775. Remember the Boston Tea Party was about taxes, and the Young Republic kept tax rates down? Look, I believe the incentive model of growth works. And I also believe you have to have a king dollar. I don't want to lose money to these other currencies.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kudlow.